On the evening of July the 31st, 2026, at 7:46 p.m., the ground beneath one of the most densely populated volcanic regions on Earth shook harder than it had in 40 years. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake tore through Campi Flegrei, the vast volcanic caldera sitting just west of Naples, Italy. 21 people were injured. Rail service across two major commuter lines shut down instantly. The port of Pozzuoli closed, cutting off ferry access to the islands of Ischia and Procida in the middle of peak summer tourist season. And this wasn't an isolated shock. INGV, Italy's National Volcanological Institute, confirmed at least 10 aftershocks followed within hours, the strongest hitting magnitude, 3.8, out in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, part of a swarm of more than 30 tremors that rattled the region through the night. 500,000 people live directly inside this caldera, and the ground beneath every single one of them has been rising, almost without pause, for over 2 decades. This is the story of Campi Flegrei, Europe's most closely watched supervolcano, and why the events of this year, specifically, have volcanologists using language they don't use lightly. Drop a comment right now. If you've ever lived near an active volcanic zone or felt ground shake in a place you didn't expect it to, tell me where. And if you want the moment anything changes at Campi Flegrei, subscribe right now. It's free, and it's the fastest way to see the update the second it happens. A thumbs up helps enormously. Let's get this one to 5,000 likes, so the people who need to see it actually do. Now let's get into it. What Campi Flegrei actually is, most people picture a volcano as a mountain. Campi Flegrei is not that. It's a caldera, a vast collapsed volcanic depression, roughly 12 to 13 kilometers across, straddling land and sea just west of Naples, partially submerged in the Gulf of Pozzuoli. Rather than one central peak, the caldera contains dozens of craters, vents, and hydrothermal features scattered across a landscape where hundreds of thousands of ordinary people live their entire lives on top of an active volcanic system, many without a second thought about what sits beneath their homes. Campi Flegrei last erupted in 1538, in an event that built an entirely new mountain, Monte Nuovo, in the span of a single week. Since then, it has spent nearly 5 centuries in a state of relative repose, the longest quiet stretch in its recent geological history. But quiet for a system like this has never meant still. The caldera has produced measurable unrest episodes for more than 70 years, with sharp 2-year spikes of activity in the 1950s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, each accompanied by tens of thousands of small earthquakes and dramatic ground uplift. The coastal town of Pozzuoli, sitting close to the center of the caldera, has been lifted by nearly 4 meters since the mid-20th century, roughly the height of a double-decker bus, purely from the slow rise and fall of the ground caused by fluid and gas movement deep below the surface. The current unrest, and why it looks different from the past, what makes the present phase of activity stand out from those earlier spikes is not any single dramatic number. It's the pattern. Unrest at Campi Flegrei has been building steadily since 2005, and unlike the sharp 2-year spikes of previous decades that eventually settled back down, this phase has continued accelerating for nearly 2 decades without returning to a stable baseline. Since 2005, the ground across the caldera has risen by more than 140 centimeters. Earthquake frequency has climbed alongside it, shifting from occasional isolated tremors to sustained clustering, concentrated at shallow depths beneath towns like Pozzuoli. Researchers at UCL and Italy's National Research Institute for Geophysics and Volcanology published findings showing that the crust beneath Campi Flegrei has become measurably weaker and more prone to rupturing as this unrest has continued, a finding published in Nature's Communications, Earth and Environment Journal. Their model found that the pattern of earthquakes recorded from 2020 onward suggests the rock is now responding in an inelastic way, meaning it is breaking rather than simply bending under the accumulating stress, a meaningful shift in how the system is behaving mechanically compared to earlier decades. Then, in April of this year, a peer-reviewed analysis using decades of seismic and ground deformation data introduced a specific and startling projection. The research described the acceleration in uplift and seismicity as better explained by what scientists call a finite time singularity, a mathematical pattern where a trend converges toward a specific window rather than simply growing indefinitely, and the window the analysis pointed to cites around the year 2033. Projections based on current trends suggest ground uplift across the caldera could approach 4 meters total by the early 2030s if the present rate holds, a level that would exceed anything recorded during the 20th century's unrest episodes. What's actually happening underground? Here's the mechanism that explains why a supervolcano can produce this kind of sustained ground movement without an eruption ever occurring, and it's more specific than simply magma rising. Recent research out of Stanford, published in Science Advances, identified rising pressure inside a geothermal reservoir sitting beneath Pozzuoli as the driving force behind this pattern of swarms and deformation. The system works something like a sealed pressure vessel. A layer of rock, referred to as the caprock, sits above the reservoir and has a natural tendency to self-heal and reseal any small fractures that open within it. When that caprock reseals effectively, it traps water and vapor beneath it, allowing pressure inside the reservoir to build steadily until the rock eventually fractures again, releasing a burst of seismicity and surface deformation before the caprock partially seals once more, and the pressure begins rebuilding all over again. This single mechanism, according to the research team's analysis, explains the recurrence of overpressured reservoir behavior both during the unrest of the early 1980s and again across the past 15 years, which is a genuinely significant finding, because it means at least part of what's driving today's swarms may not require fresh magma pushing upward from depth at all. It can be explained by a self-reinforcing pressure cycle in the hydrothermal system sitting above the magmatic reservoir. That distinction matters enormously for how scientists interpret each new earthquake swarm. It does not, however, eliminate the deeper question hanging over the whole system: whether the geochemical signatures accompanying this unrest, which multiple research teams describe as consistent with increasing magmatic input from greater depth, mean the system is genuinely building toward something larger, or cycling through a pattern it has repeated before without ever reaching an eruption. The debate scientists themselves are having? This is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over, because it's the honest state of the science right now. Volcanologists are openly split on how to interpret the current data. The 488-year gap since Campi Flegrei's last eruption is, by itself, an unusually long repose period for this specific volcanic system, and that fact alone fuels active debate over whether the extended quiet means the system is gradually winding down after centuries of slow pressure release, or whether it means pressure has been quietly building across that entire span and is now approaching a point where it cannot be contained the way it has been in the past. The accelerating trend since 2005, combined with geochemical signals pointing to increasing input from deeper magmatic sources rather than purely shallow hydrothermal activity, has pushed a meaningful portion of the research community toward the more concerning interpretation. But it's important to be precise about what that interpretation actually claims and doesn't claim. Even the researchers behind the 2033 projection are not asserting that an eruption is guaranteed by that date. Their finding describes a critical mechanical threshold, a point where the accumulated crustal stress reaches levels beyond what has been recorded in the past, not a confirmed eruption forecast. INGV's own official position, reflected in its routine monitoring bulletins throughout this year, has consistently held that the probability of an eruption in the near term remains low, even as monitored parameters, including seismicity, deformation rate, and gas emissions, continue trending upward. Why 500,000 people living on top of this matters so much. Even without an eruption, Campi Flegrei has repeatedly demonstrated that its unrest alone is disruptive enough to force real consequences for the people living inside it. Earlier uplift episodes in the 20th century forced the evacuation of tens of thousands of Pozzuoli residents purely due to the structural risk posed by ground deformation and associated earthquake damage to buildings, without any eruption ever occurring. The current phase, running longer and reaching greater cumulative displacement than those historical episodes, is now testing infrastructure and emergency planning against a scenario Italian authorities have not had to manage at this scale before. The July 31st earthquake made that tangible in a single evening. A magnitude 4.7 event, while modest on the global scale of significant earthquakes, was strong enough to injure 21 people, suspend rail service across the Cumana and Circumflegrei lines, and shut down an active port serving inhabited islands, all in a region where the population density sitting directly above the unrest zone runs into the hundreds of thousands. Residents on Procida and Ischia reported feeling the shock sharply, despite sitting offshore from the caldera's center, and the swarm of more than 30 tremors that followed through the night meant a population that had already lived through a steadily climbing baseline of seismicity absorbed yet another reminder that this baseline keeps moving in one direction. What actually determines what happens next? The uncomfortable truth about supervolcano monitoring is that the tools available, ground deformation measurement, seismic network data, gas geochemistry, can describe the trend with real precision while still leaving genuine uncertainty about the endpoint. INGV's monitoring network tracks all of these signals continuously and has done so through every prior spike in this multi-decade unrest episode. What scientists will be watching most closely in the coming months is whether the rate of uplift and the frequency of seismic swarms continue the accelerating pattern documented since 2005, whether geochemical signatures continue to point toward increasing magmatic input rather than stabilizing, and whether the crust's inelastic fracturing response documented since 2020 continues or eases. None of that is a basis for panic based on what's confirmed today. INGV's own current assessment maintains that near-term eruption probability remains low. But it is a serious basis for sustained attention, for continued investment in emergency planning, for the hundreds of thousands of residents living directly inside an active caldera, and for taking seriously a body of research that has, over the past year specifically, converged on describing this unrest as genuinely different in character from the recurring spikes of previous decades. Final thought. Campi Flegrei has spent nearly 500 years since its last eruption proving that a volcano can remain profoundly active, unpredictable, and disruptive without ever reaching that final threshold. The events of the past 2 decades, and especially the past year, have not settled the debate among the scientists who study it most closely over whether this pattern will continue that way indefinitely, or whether it's now approaching genuinely new territory. What has changed is the confidence with which serious, peer-reviewed research is now naming a specific window, the early 2030s, as a point worth watching closely, rather than treating this as an open-ended, indefinite unrest cycle the way earlier decades were understood. 500,000 people live inside this caldera today. The ground beneath them has not stopped rising in over 20 years, and on July 31st, it reminded an entire region, in the middle of its busiest tourist season, exactly how present that fact still is. We'll keep tracking this closely. Every new swarm, every INGV bulletin, every new piece of research coming out of Pozzuoli and Naples. Subscribe so you don't miss the update the moment anything changes. And drop that comment. Have you ever lived somewhere the ground moved in ways you didn't expect? I read every one of them. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. See you in the next one.